Earlier today, we had the good fortune of hearing not one but two keynote speakers, two of the more impressive, I believe, and admirable public servants that we have the good fortune of working with in the state of California. But our next speaker, if you'll give me a host's prerogative for a moment, is somebody really exceptional. I've known Darrell Steinberg for 20 years. I met him right after he first got elected to the California State Assembly, and have known him and worked with him and admired him and his work, both when we've agreed and when we've disagreed over those 20 years. He served in the California State Assembly and later in the California State Senate, served for several years as the pro tem, the leader of the California State Senate, and now, of course, as many of you know, is the mayor of Sacramento, California. I was just sharing with Darrell before we started the program again, a lesson that I teach to my students at USC in Berkeley. And when I talk to them about political leadership, I tell them that there are two types of political leadership. There are legislative leaders and there are executive leaders. Both are important. One isn't necessarily superior to the other. But I've always come to believe that it's two different skill sets that allow an exceptional man or woman to lead in an exceptional way. And I was just telling Darrell Steinberg that after watching him many, many years as a legislative leader, and now as an equally impressive and admirable executive leader, now I'm going to have to rework my syllabus for fall semester. So thanks very much, Darrell. I really appreciate it. He really is one of California's most impressive public servants. And when I talked earlier about the importance of the public and the private and the nonprofit sector working together to have the kind of conversations to take on the type of challenges we're discussing over the course of the day, there's no better example of someone who forges those kind of coalitions and those kind of partnerships than the mayor of Sacramento, California, and our next speaker, the very honorable Darrell Steinberg.
Dan, thank you very, very much for a very generous introduction. I'm really flattered that after all these years, well, I'll put it this way. So I've been out of office 4 years out of 26 in between. I termed out of the Assembly, sat out 2 years, ran for the Senate, served 8 years, sat out 2 years, and ran for mayor of Sacramento. I was always grateful during the interim times when anyone introducing me for a speech refrained from calling me the formerly honorable Darrell Steinberg. You're now that I'm quasi-honorable again, I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate your dedication to California, which has been decades long, and to be with you here again today. So today's subject is housing finance, but I want to tell you a little story because you stand here, and thank you to the Milken Institute, of course, for bringing together some of the best minds and policymakers in California to solve problems here. And I will just say as one further introductory note before I tell my story that when Dan speaks about executive versus legislative leadership, he's right. There is a difference, but there really are some significant commonalities. What good leaders try to do is to set tangible, real goals and then work with people to actually reach them. That's what it is. That's the secret sauce. And what it takes to get there, of course, is different depending upon your role. But if you keep in mind that you want to accomplish something for the people, and you have to work with people, and sometimes go around people, but try to work with people, then you can be successful in either branch of government. So here's the story. You are here at the Kimpton, at the Sawyer, right next to the Golden One Center. And this is a big piece and big pride of our ever-growing city. Well, in 2013, this occurred in part because I authored a bill, SB 743, that essentially said that the folks trying to steal the Sacramento Kings from Seattle could not sue and enjoin the project. But there were other parts of that bill that people maybe remember less. It was probably the most robust effort in many years to attempt, and I use the word attempt because I don't think I was dramatically successful, attempt CEQA reform. What the bill did was it essentially objectified traffic analysis, changed the LOS standard to vehicle miles traveled. It allows tiering from specific plans without requiring additional environmental review for projects consistent with the specific plan. And then it built upon my earlier AB 900 that allowed 270 days of litigation for high-profile jobs projects that would otherwise take 5 to 10 years to get through the litigation cycle. Good stuff. But the goal was to achieve something bigger and broader. And so I remember thinking and saying many times that the problem with regulatory reform, especially around housing, is this, and take CEQA as an example. You can take any provision of that law and you can cite multiple examples where that provision has been used to save the redwoods, and you can look at that same provision and cite examples of where it was abused to stop a good project. And that story, if you will, my experience, speaks to the challenges, one of the main challenges of our affordable housing crisis. And the word that I want to use, which is a little bit of a policy wonk word, is the word alignment. Because what we have failed to do in California around housing is we have failed to align our objectives with our policies and our finances. Why is it that the Environmental Quality Act, which I'm a fan of, by the way, I think it's done many great things, but why is it that the approval process for projects that we say we want more of, affordable infill housing, for example, is no different than the process to site an oil refinery? Now, that may be a little bit overstated because there are some laws, my SB 375, some other laws that make it a little bit easier, but in the main, it is just as hard because we prize local control and we prize the ability of affected neighbors and litigants to be able to complain. Why is it that there is little difference between the process for what we say we want more of versus what we say we either don't want more of or don't care as much about? At the same time, we know we want and need a clean environment. If you were in Sacramento yesterday, I thought I awoke from a nuclear disaster. I mean, that's maybe, again, overstated, but it was horrible. I've never seen anything like it before, and that's the result of the fires, of course. But we must have policies in this state of California that incentivize and make it easier to build more housing that is affordable and that is consistent with a good, clean environment. And if we can agree that that is a vital goal, and if we can agree that paying the men and women who construct what we want more of deserve a living, prevailing, high wage, you then have two pillars of a potential policy that allows working people to do well as our cities grow, to be able to afford where they live, and at the same time to speed up the production of desperately needed housing. And then you get to the question of financing, which I know is today's main topic. How does government, which plays an important role in affecting, obviously, this key issue, how do we use our funding streams as an appropriate carrot, even a hard carrot, as I like to say, a hard carrot to get the results that we want and need? For those who say it's all about fixing the regulatory environment, they're only telling half the story. For those who say it's only about more housing subsidy to build more affordable housing, they're only telling half the story. We need both. And the state must commit to housing funding, in my view, in as robust a way as the state has shown over decades a commitment to transportation funding, because the two go together. But housing, frankly, always lags. Even last year's heroic effort by Pro Tem Atkins to create a permanent source of funding is only a beginning. In some cities, the annual allocation is $100,000. And so as a city mayor here, though my role is different, we are going to work with the state in every way that we can, but we're also going to seek to take control of our own destiny. And as one example, this November we are bringing before the people what we call Measure U. And it is an effort to raise a sales tax to invest directly in inclusive economic development, including affordable housing. We're going to seek to take a half cent, $50 million a year, potentially securitize half of it, and create a capital equity trust fund of almost $500 million. And to use at least 20% of that to establish a housing trust fund that allows us, in combination with a better regulatory environment, with supporting working people, to actually set a production goal and to actually reach it. And I suppose in my remaining 30 seconds before you hear from the esteemed panel, I want to make one other point about state policy and about the work that we're all gathered here to talk about today. We must be about accountability and production. For if we don't hold ourselves, including cities, accountable for actually producing the number of units that are going to be needed, we're always going to fall short. And if we set a goal and we fall short, we'll at least come much closer to the production goal than if we didn't set a goal in the first place. It's not enough anymore to cut a ribbon and to meet part of the need. We've got to align funding, regulatory reform, which requires us to work, yes, with organized labor and ensure that the residential housing industry pays the people who work and construct the right kind of wage. And we must have robust and targeted financing that supports a real production goal that is big, even if we meet it over the course of many years. Those are my few thoughts from the capital city. I welcome you to Sacramento. I welcome you to the site that was actually the focus of a lot of this discussion, not around so much housing, but around CEQA and CEQA reform. We got started in 2013. There's a lot more work to do. I look forward to working with you. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel on Will Innovative Financing Solve California's Housing Shortage? Moderated by Capital Public Radio's Beth Ruyak.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. You have choices at this moment, so we appreciate that you're with us, and we'll keep it nice and lively, which is sort of the atmosphere of Capital Public Radio's newsroom anyway right now, being innovative in our thinking. So let me introduce this panel. To my left, Steve Hansen. You just met Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg. Steve is the Vice Mayor of Sacramento. And so let me begin right away with the question that we have at hand, which is, will innovative financing solve California's housing shortage? Steve, yes or no?
Yes, it is a piece of the solution, but there are many other parts if we're going to be successful in resolving our housing affordability crisis.
Okay, Steve gets a yes. Laura Foote-Clark is next to me. She is in charge of the people screaming, literally and figuratively, about housing and housing development. She's the executive director of YIMBY Action. So, innovative financing, is it going to solve the problem, yes or no?
If you're doing a dichotomy, no. But I do think that I agree with Steve that unfortunately it took us 40 years of bad policy to get to where we are. And so there are a lot of pieces that we have to untangle. A lot of policy.
Stop.
Oh,
I heard a no.
okay.
Yes, qualified. We're going to keep it moving for you folks. Carla Barano is with us from Genentech. She is the Vice President of Site Services. She is in charge of an enormous campus in South San Francisco. Innovative financing, is that going to solve the problem?
Actually, I think there's plenty of capital out there. It's unlocking it. I think it's around policy and politics.
I heard a yes. Did you hear a yes?
No, I heard a
No, it's a
no.
no.
You heard a no.
Hard no.
There's enough capital.
And that, folks, is why we fact check this day and age, okay? So let me tell you that PolitiFact California at Cap Radio is very active, and I have a great staff on my show at Insight, and we do exactly that. The next person to introduce is Bill Witt. I don't expect Bill to be demure or calm during this panel. He is the chairman and CEO of Related California. Innovative financing as a developer, is that going to solve our problem?
No. It is essential to solving the affordable housing crisis. But in the larger picture, I think Darrell put it well, it's just a piece.
Thank you, Bill. And to my far right is California Assembly Member David Chu from the 17th District. David was a key part of the package of 15 bills that were passed and signed into law historically by Governor Brown last year. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
For a brief time, you are going to have to step out to get to the Democratic caucus meeting, but yes or no?
Yo,
Innovative financing.
that's my answer. Clearly,
That's cheating.
clearly we need money, but that's not going to be enough to solve the whole problem.
All right. So it's interesting to think about where we've gotten to. Little perspective. Anybody here last year at the Milken Housing Forum, the California Housing Forum? Nobody.
I was here.
You were
got a
there?
few.
I was, yeah.
I remember I saw you here.
That's right.
It was a really good meeting, wasn't it?
It was brilliant. You did a great job.
The good thing about it is that I can tell you that the title was The Future of the State's Housing Dilemma and Its Economy. And the questions went something like, do you remember this, Steve? What is the problem? How are we going to deal with it? How do we identify who's involved in the problem? And that was 15 months ago. How far have we come, Assemblymember Chu, from last year when you said, I can't seem to get the solution through the goalpost because the goalpost keeps moving?
So last year at this time, we had not made the progress that we wanted, in part because all the stakeholders who were involved all wanted different things. And I often describe the politics of housing as a lot of folks pointing guns at each other. And by that I mean cities, say, want money from the industry and would oppose regulatory reform or any type of streamlining. Whereas the industry would say, we don't want to have to pay for money to do this. We think there should be streamlining. So they would support one thing and shoot down other things. And every time one idea would roll down the legislative process, it would get killed by one set of stakeholders and supported by another. I think what changed last year was the magnitude of the crisis caused everyone to say we need all the above solutions. So when I say yo, it's about getting everything on the table, supporting multiple things, and using that as a basis for compromise.
It's also the advantage of being last on the panel, right? You can sit and really think up your good answer. But you're talking about what Mayor Steinberg just mentioned in one word, and that word was alignment. So when we talk about the housing crisis, do we have housing as a problem, and do we have housing finance as a problem? Are they two somewhat separate arenas?
I think they're certainly separate but related. They have the word housing in both of them. One of the big challenges is we have not had enough money to, as Bill Witte said, build the affordable housing that we need. And I think we need to think about traditional answers like expanding the affordable housing tax credit, bringing back some version of redevelopment. but also thinking innovatively. I've proposed in recent years that we think about the billions of dollars that we are currently spending on a mortgage interest deduction and whether that's the best use of money, whether we could use that money to build affordable housing. I've also proposed exempting up property taxes for developers that build so-called missing middle housing. We've got to think about finance, but we also have to think about housing more generally, all of the barriers to creating housing. We need to think about streamlining. We've got to think about the hurdles. We need to hold cities accountable for building housing when their constituents cry about a housing crisis, but then say, but I don't want to build a housing next door. We talk about homelessness, but we don't want to build supportive housing. How do we move beyond that conundrum?
To have some direct contrast, we had a strong yes and a strong no to the question. So, Steve, your arena is finance. Why are you convinced that innovative financing is the solution, or at least a strongest factor in the solution?
Well, I think, first of all, the politics around housing are rough. We've inflicted this problem on ourselves through bad policy, the prevention of building multifamily, CEQA, all of these things that allow people to say no.
Hang on. Does everybody agree? Did we create this problem ourselves?
Yes.
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 Is it more of a political problem than anything else?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
But it's also financial because we have some challenges in this state around the cost of labor, materials. Sacramento and the Bay Area are part of this mega region, and the Bay Area drives our fundamentals here when it comes to those costs. So we do need innovative financing, and I'll give you a great example. Well, redevelopment has gone away. Cap and trade was pitched to us as a way to fix that, but Sacramento can't compete. We don't get cap and trade money for our affordable housing projects because the way the system is designed doesn't allow us to score well enough. Where with redevelopment, we had sort of a predictable amount we could bond out or we could dedicate. Now Cal HFA, the Housing Finance Authority, has come up with an innovative loan product that if you do a mixed income project, you can get 40 to 50% affordable at a pretty deep subsidy. Workforce housing is definitely in that, the 80 to 120 AMI, and it helps projects go. So a mixed use, mid-rise, multifamily, mixed income project can be financed with an innovative solution like that that helps overcome the policy and political challenges that otherwise price it out of our market.
Assemblymember Chu, did he just make an argument for why there is no national strategy or policy on housing, and maybe there never can be?
I don't know if I want to talk about how I think about the Trump administration at this point. That might take a while.
I
but
didn't say that word.
it's clear that at this time there is no national strategy. In fact, it's the opposite. When you have HUD cutting billions of dollars of resources to states like California, when you have tax policy changes that are gutting our ability to use affordable housing tax credit tools, it's a real problem. So we are going to have to solve this ourselves. And as I think all of us would say, it will take all of the above solutions. Last year, we had a major breakthrough with the package of bills that you just described, but I often talk about them as an initial down payment on solving the problem, and all of us in this room know down payments solve 20% of your problem. And the number of units that we're going to have to build in the coming years requires us to build at 5, 6, 7 times the rate as we've been building, and that's going to mean we have to do everything all at once, as well as ideas that I think no one's yet thought of.
In the midst of the cheers last September, as the governor was signing that housing package from the LA Times, September 29th, still, the array of new laws Brown signed Friday will hardly put a dent in the state's housing problems. Developers need to build about 100,000 new homes each year beyond what's already planned, simply to keep pace with California's population growth. Money's a factor in there, Bill, but why is your no so loud?
So it's a good question for me because we are the state's largest developer of mixed income housing by a lot, and one of the largest developers of 100% affordable housing. We do innovative financing every day. That's what we do. But if it takes 3 years to get a project with no opposition in San Francisco approved and costs go up 40% in those 3 years, you're barely making a dent in the problem. So, of course, innovative financing matters, but until the process can be addressed in a meaningful way, City of Seattle, very similar to San Francisco, progressive, tech-oriented, et cetera. Takes 15 months on average to get a project approved. In most of California's urban areas, Darrell spoke to this, 3 years, if you're lucky. Until you move that needle, you're not going to get there.
Carl,
Just say
go ahead.
that the city of Sacramento can be an example for how to do this right. In 2013, we fought very hard to make housing a by right entitlement for up to 78 units at the time, and now we've pushed that to 150 units. We're working on implementing a bill, actually like the one that Assemblymember Chu is doing, to within a quarter to half mile of our transit stops, allowing for increased density. And we're doing all that largely with the public processes we have, but by being an assertive jurisdiction, we're kind of getting out of our own way. Pushing these decisions out of the hands of elected officials, in our case, has helped us get around some of the market forces that otherwise would have meant that we can't build. So I say to local elected officials, let this be staff decided, move those decisions down, and get out of the way between the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs so things can happen.
There is a reason that Carla is on this panel, and it has to do with what you just heard a little bit earlier this morning, and that is all about jobs and education and the alignment of the, as Carla says, the ecosystem of the economy. And that if you're going to create jobs, whether they be those 750 aerospace PhDs or the Amazon manufacturing job, people have to live where they're going to work. So for Genentech, there's an important place for your voice in this discussion. Is your voice being listened to, and how do you make sure it's there?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying, Genentech, we're not in the business of building houses and driving, a lot of policies around that. We're the first biotech company. We've been around for 40 years, and our mission is to discover and develop important medicines for life-threatening and very serious conditions like cancer and multiple sclerosis. We have a long-standing commitment of being a force for good in the community. And what we're seeing now with the housing is that's no different. We need to stand up and have our voices heard. And as one of the largest employers in the Bay Area, we understand that housing availability for all income levels is absolutely integral to sustaining a diverse and talented workforce, for a robust economy, as well as a vibrant local community. When you think about what we have in South San Francisco, where our headquarters at, we have a very, very large campus. So we have, office functions, commercial functions, R&D. In fact, we spend $10 billion annually in research and development, more money than any other life science company. But we also have a very large manufacturing complex in South San Francisco, over 1 million square feet just in manufacturing. And when you think about the ecosystem and you think about all of the different people that actually support that operation beyond Genentech employees, these are service workers, these are folks that help run our utility operations.
So Carla, what do you want David to know when he's in his next housing committee meeting and he's chairing the next small gathering of the biggest minds working on this problem? What do you want him to know that's going to be forward thinking so that all those people are going to be able to live and work at the Genentech campus?
I think he knows. I think we're all in alignment here. We're in vehement alignment that we actually have to come together and, as Mayor Steinberg said, align all of the stakeholders to come up with innovative solutions. We've got to be able to increase production of housing units. We've got to protect folks that are in their houses and protect the existing residents.
Of all the squeaky wheels you listen to, how squeaky is business?
I would say somewhat squeaky, but it needs to be squeakier.
Yeah.
And let me say that what you just heard about the challenge of our housing jobs imbalance, that is a huge driver of the crisis, particularly in the Bay Area, but around the state. Those very industries that are fueling the economic success of California are exacerbating the housing crisis. We have seen 5 to 6 times as many jobs created in the Bay Area in recent years as we have had housing units. And so we need to think about creative solutions. A few I'll just toss out is I think cities that are happy to welcome jobs but not build housing need to be appropriately incented or disincented. So in the Bay Area, you may have heard about Cupertino, happy to bring 12,000 new Apple jobs, but their mayor says we don't have a housing problem. Brisbane, ready to build thousands of new jobs and said our workers can live in Oakland, San Jose, and San Francisco. I could go on and on with the list, but we've got to think differently about how we incent cities to do the right thing. If you want the job creation, that's great, but you've got to take your part in building the housing. And I would also add, we need to think about transit-oriented development. I have a bill at this moment that would say that there are 300 acres of surface parking lots around BART stations in the Bay Area, for those of you who know of our transit system. And we have local officials who are saying, we want to control how that happens. Well, they've had 45 years of BART's existence to control what happens, and instead we've got surface parking lots. We have to just think differently about how we build housing next to jobs, next to transit in a way that's smart, in a way that allows us to grow and really be a 21st century growth area.
David, do you know about Related California's Santa Monica project?
A little bit. I'm sure Bill's going to tell me about it soon.
Well, we did a project with the city of Santa Monica that finished 3 years ago. 2 blocks from the ocean in the Civic Center area, they had bought land from a private company, designated it for mixed income housing. We paid them to build 158 luxury condos that sold for $1,700 a square foot. And they took the money, combined it with state funds, and we built 160 low-income family rentals right next door, the same block that we own and manage today, and then they added a park. Cities control land. They can do things with land. And I want to make a plug on that note for David's push to extend the property tax exemption to this workforce missing middle. We've run numbers on that in San Francisco. Just that alone, without additional subsidy, you could provide housing for people making 80 to 100% of median. But the cities would be foregoing some property taxes. It's either a priority or it isn't. And a combination of incentives and maybe a little push, you could begin to make a difference.
I know the assembly member has to leave us at this point, but will you leave with this thought? Going forward, where's your emphasis for introducing legislation, and how much a part of what you want to accomplish is related to finance?
Well, obviously, as someone who said the answer has to be all of the above, we have a pretty robust housing agenda, and certainly as this legislative session ends and as a new governor comes in, we're going to have to even do more. And so some of the answers have to be around financing. As I mentioned before, a significant expansion of the affordable housing tax credit. I think we need to bring back redevelopment 2.0, tax increment financing. It was something that worked in particularly when it came to housing and infrastructure. I also think, as Bill Whitty just alluded to, I think we should exempt property taxes for folks that are trying to build housing that we're not building at this time, for those firefighters and nurses and retail workers and middle-class families that are being pushed out of expensive areas. But that's just part of the financing side of the problem. We've got to think about tackling how we streamline better, how we hold cities more accountable, how we call out the inconsistency when you have neighbors that are opposing projects and saying, we care about homelessness, we care about housing, but just not in my backyard. That has to change. And collectively, if, for example, as I poked a little bit of fun at our Democratic nominee, Gavin Newsom, if we are going to be serious about producing 3.5 million units of housing over the next 8 years, which is something he's committed to, all of us are going to have to think differently. We are all going to have to get out of our comfort zone and do new things. My hope is there are folks here in this room who will be able to help us think of these innovative solutions, and I look forward to
You
working
were
with all
so
of
good, you get a bonus question, and that is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much might this housing conversation and view change under a new administration?
You know, I have great hope for a new administration. In fact, assuming hopefully the candidate I'm supporting, Gavin Newsom, becomes governor, he's really the first governor to commit to a significant increase in the amount of housing that we need to build. He has put out a lot of different ideas on how to do it, and I think we're going to need all of them and more. So I'm looking forward to hopefully working with his administration and the business community, as well as the diversity of communities who all need to work together to figure this out.
All right, everybody, let's give him a yo. Assemblymember David Chu. Thank you so much for joining us.
And if I can add, if you
He
were really
set you up
inspired,
perfectly.
Well,
So
but if you were really inspired by what he had to say, I mean, the audience here, I think, sometimes underestimates how important it is to reach out and contact your elected officials. There are squeaky wheels. I mean, we've talked about, asking you all to be the squeaky wheel a little bit more and send an email right now. It's the one thing I'll let you do on your cell phone right now. Send an email to your representative to support AB 2923 so that we turn more of those BART parking lots into housing.
So, Laura, you have a secret innovative weapon that just happens to not have been born to be part of a previous generation. And I think you know what I'm talking about. The young people with their loud voices. How much of a tool are the millennials now?
Oh, I thought you were talking about Twitter.
Well,
Yeah.
Twitter's populated by them, but even bigger than that, this group of young people who, by and large, aren't owning homes. They're in a housing mindset much differently than previous generations. But how important are they to you as an activist tool?
I mean, they're critical. To some degree, the fact that millennials are stunted is really good for an organizer. They've put off having kids, so they're a little bit more active than they would otherwise be. They're angry, and they're frustrated that they can't purchase a home. They are renting and living with other people so they can bug their roommate when it's time to go to a meeting. That demographic is extremely active. I would also say that there's an opportunity for older people to see a pro-housing movement as offering something for them as well. I think we have a lot of people who are, especially women, in sprawling homes that no longer make sense for them. And there isn't a condo that they could scale down to in their neighborhood that would maybe have a grocery store that meant that they could live independently for a little bit longer. More housing and more different kinds of housing in a community is really beneficial for a much wider demographic than just millennials. It's nice, I think, for older people to maybe get the millennials out of the basement and into their own apartment, but there are a lot of reasons that communities should be supporting a lot more housing right where they are.
Is she speaking about any of you? It's got to be more than one hand out there. And oh, there's another. And if it's not you, you know people in this situation. So Laura, how do you and Bill work together to accomplish what he wants to accomplish and what you're fighting for? And have you had reason and opportunity to do that?
I mean, what's very interesting is that, and David mentioned it, in the last, I've been doing this a long time, both in the public and private side. I've never seen the attention given to housing that we've seen in the last couple of years, number one. Number two, there's never been a YIMBY that Steve, I don't know, I don't recall such a group like that.
It is new, Bill.
And I have 3 millennials. But where I think there's an interesting challenge is groups like YIMBY and their affiliate Housing Action Council in San Francisco at the macro level have been crucial in focusing attention on this. Where, I'll just be provocative for a second. We've had some major entitlements in San Francisco, successful. And I told them, don't come to the Planning Commission. We've negotiated with the neighborhoods. You get into this kind of a thing. So at the micro level, sometimes I'm thinking, let us do this. But if they didn't do the macro, we wouldn't even have the chance. The other thing I'd say is we can talk about all this stuff. Money matters in Sacramento. It's pictures of dead presidents. And they are fundraising, and it's going to make a difference. And don't underestimate that at the legislative level.
So I just want to come back to this because it's something I've heard Laura say repeatedly, that the project-by-project activism and advocacy is really draining the energy from the movement. Because largely it's seen by people who are against projects as benefiting developers at the expense of communities, when overall, Bill, the point you made about the macro, until we get the policy reform, we have to fight project by project. And there is change happening, and I'm filling in for Senator Scott Wiener today. He's been working along with Assemblymember Chu and Assemblymember Ting and others to move this conversation from a nibbling around the edges of policy reform, which is good. We need more ADUs. We need these other things to be streamlined. SB 35 in the housing package last year that allowed people to skip local entitlement or bypass CEQA if they met certain requirements. That's good, but ultimately, unless we reform the way we look at housing creation, housing finance, we're just going to be screwed. We're already 1 million units behind of what we should have produced. And as I was talking earlier to my friend from Genentech, this is a lot like the healthcare crisis. We saw premiums going up, like rents going up. We saw limited access, a system struggling, people going bankrupt, trying to provide for themselves. And we do need, in some ways, a Affordable Housing Act, like we had an Affordable Care Act, to fix this problem.
A national policy.
Well, but DC's doing nothing. In fact, they created harm in reducing the value of tax credits during the tax reform conversation, reform, quote unquote. But I do think California, if Governor Newsom can grab this issue and do some things, it's going to be entitlement reform, CEQA reform. It's going to help put some checks on local governments that just say no. You can build somewhere else, but we don't want you. And really undo some of our legacy around racism that said multifamily units weren't welcome in many of these communities because they brought people who were of lower income and largely people of color, and they said they didn't want that.
Just for the record, racial covenants could be an entire panel, and it still should be in the housing conversation because of the active role that they play, at least on the books, but also in the mindset and the perception of housing issues. Would you, because we're saying YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, would you clearly spell out what the mission of your YIMBY group is?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to not be working on housing in 20 years because we've actually solved the problem.
What would that look like?
So solving the problem in general, we think housing is considered generally affordable when people are spending about 30% of their income on rent. And we're going to have to change a lot of laws permanently so that we are consistently building the housing we need and so that we never go to another hearing ever again. Because project by project advocacy is fundamentally unsustainable. The benefits of the project are felt diffusely by a lot of people everywhere, and the supposed negative effects are clearly identifiable. A housing project takes place in a specific location, and the people who think that it's going to negatively affect them get their neighborhood notifications and get very upset, and they come out and they say, no, 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 not here, not here, not here. And to organize a diffuse group of people to say yes here and everywhere over and over and over again for the next 25 years is not going to get us the housing that we need. And I would also say, there's this problem of producers and consumers, right? So fundamentally, YIMBY is a consumer advocacy group. We are people who want to live in housing. And things are really broken when consumers and producers are on the same side. And that's what we see. And then you see places where our incentives are not quite aligned. And sometimes on project by project advocacy, most of the time they're relatively aligned, but sometimes they're not quite because a developer is willing to say, okay, we'll give up 2 floors of housing because the neighbors just won't get off our backs. And so we'll lose, 100 units of housing just to get through the entitlement process. We'll pay off these people. We'll make this deal just to get through the process. And I will say that, YIMBYs don't want to see the process get worse. And so sometimes we are like, that is a terrible deal. Please don't do that. And that, so that's a place where consumers and producers sometimes have a little bit of friction because we want the entire system to be fixed overall. I will say, though, that live tweeting from hearings is really fun. People say the craziest stuff at community meetings. And when you put it on Twitter, it's a little bit more exposure to what the discourse on that project by project really is.
So pause.
Yeah.
Are you paying attention when a neighborhood group rises up either a yes or no? Do you notice that? Does it matter? Are you wondering whether your employees living in the area are voicing their own concern?
I think that's where the opportunity is for businesses to engage. And I think that businesses have a unique role to play in how we think about, engaging on this topic. Because at the end of the day, it's our employees that are living in
Right.
these communities. And so I think that's where there's an opportunity to do some education and help just engage our employees, whether they're for or against. It's just helping them understand what the issues are. And again, if I step back to having a thriving jobs market and regional economy, we've got to really start thinking about how we move the needle on this. And it's
Cost of construction
Yes.
is important to you.
absolutely.
Expand on that.
So when we talk about sort of the financing, and this is really more, in your area, I know what the cost of construction is for us was we build our R&D labs in manufacturing, but we've got to find innovative ways to lower that cost of construction, whether it's through the permitting, the high cost of permitting, or the high cost of labor. And labor is a challenge. I mean, we've got a manufacturing facility, about 30 minutes from here, and we're even finding it hard to, get labor for construction.
So right now in San Francisco, an affordable housing project is coming in at over 800,000 a unit. That is not sustainable or acceptable. Some of that are uncontrollable things, some of it are controllable. It's tough when the state mandates things. The state needs to say, I'm not giving you tax credits. That's too much. Figure it out. Make it a little better. In New York, where our parent company is, the city compromised on its property tax exemption program, continued to require prevailing wages, but they made a deal with the building trades so that on affordable housing, the rates would be here, not here or here. I mean, everybody came to the table. That hasn't happened here yet. And the numbers don't lie. And again, some of that is a national trend. By the way, I can't resist saying that tariffs don't help, believe me, in construction costs. But somehow, you got to do a carrot and a stick. There's got to be a little bit of, sorry, that's too much.
And I think
So
also,
sorry.
just let me say one more thing. I think also, too, is looking for innovative ways to actually construct homes, okay? Because construction industry has really lagged in terms of innovations and productivity. So I think that's another area that is worth pursuing, is seeing different ways to actually have construction be more effective and productive.
And you know that if Senator Weiner was here, he'd be saying, well, why does every family or every single person need a home? Why don't we even think about innovative approaches to who is in the home? Who've we gathered? What is shelter? Why are we the way we are in the United States about shelter? But there again, that's another.
Well, I don't know. I think Scott would say everyone should have access to a home.
He would. He absolutely
Yeah.
That's different than
yeah.
whether each individual or each family
I
separately
think the
needs its
debate
own
about
home.
a multi-generational household or a household that has multiple, like I still have housemates because that's how I afforded my house. I come from a family who had very little. My parents divorced when I was young. That's how I was able to pay for school, pay off those loans, or actually I'm still paying off those loans, and acquire a house because I had roommates, housemates. But I want to come back to something that Bill was talking about, because this is a debate he and I have been having for years. Related was chosen to redevelop a public housing site, along with some other folks here in Sacramento. Mercy Housing was a key partner as well. And in our housing authority is very much of a past generation. I think that's the nicest way to say it. They've gotten a federal grant to redevelop a different housing site, and the cost per unit in Sacramento, when you just look at infrastructure and everything, is coming in at over 800,000. I think it was 887,000. And there's market rate in there, there's affordable, and there's sort of some other middle income product. But the challenge is that is a ridiculous number for Sacramento, for our city to cost that much. And I think that as we look at housing as social infrastructure, a lot of people are just used to government wasting money. They're used to high-speed rail, which is a project I support, but the costs have been enormous. And at what point are we going to say that project for 335 units that cost $300 million is not worth it? When we can't get gap financing on a 40% mixed income project in Midtown that's on a former brownfield that's been cleaned up next to transit. And for $5 million, we could deliver 150 units.
So Steve, hold that. Bill, how are you about being the bad guy quite often being on the other side of the pointed finger.
Bad guy?
Well, I think I really understand. I mean, when you have a narrative and 20 years of every movie having a developer be the evil character, and you have a real idea out there in the zeitgeist that the developer has bottomless amounts of money and is here to destroy our community, that is a big thing to overcome. And then to say, okay, we have to treat housing as something that is socially desirable, that we want to happen. And what we've done instead is we've put taxes and fees and requirements as a sort of, you have to pay the community because you're going to burden us with the housing. And so we're going to put extra fees, and then we disincentivize housing, and then we act shocked and appalled when the cost of construction goes up and nobody builds it.
I think one way that certainly we've been successful, even though we're inherently the bad guy, is you can't pretend not all neighborhood residents are rabid NIMBYs. Homeless, for example, it's complicated. You can't just demonize people because they oppose something. One thing that comes up repeatedly, and Darrell alluded to it, is the I word, infrastructure. There are people who will say, all right, I get it, we need housing. But they told us they were going to improve the transit system, or they were going to shift a bus route, and the city didn't do it. So if you go in there and you don't acknowledge that kind of stuff, and then go back to City Hall yourself as the developer and tell them, you know, thanks for the housing support, but if you don't do some of these things, we have no credibility. And I think cities have to, the other part is, Steve mentioned, not everywhere, but there are a lot of agencies, especially after redevelopment ended, they lost a lot of their talent. They've sort of retreated into a bureaucratic shell, and cities, electeds and others like Steve, who does, have to push them, saying, sorry, that's not acceptable. It's not about preservation. We got to get outside the box.
So it's funny because our housing agencies aren't producing housing. And everybody just assumes that's who's going to lead the way. But without fundamental reform of those bureaucracies post-redevelopment, and even arguably during redevelopment, it went away because of the inefficient use of those dollars. We need to change them, and unfortunately people like Bill, they're at the center of the firing squad because the NIMBYs don't want them. The people who do support affordable housing development make all these extreme demands about the number of units, so projects then don't pencil. You got elected officials who run away from the fight, and they just let everybody else sort it out rather than holding the line to get housing built. And you've got staff also usually running for cover. So until somebody begins to stand up for housing construction, the financing can help, and it can get a project over some of those hurdles that policy has created, but the policy and the political leadership has to change.
So this is perhaps, I think, again, where business has a role, because at the end of the day, for Genentech, if we aren't able to attract and retain employees to help us make these life-saving medicines, then we're failing as a company. And so I think that's where it becomes a business imperative in the region to help bring these disparate voices together and align and move this conversation forward. We have to. I mean, and we have such a thriving economy here, and we've got to continue that.
I mean, this is where all roads full of potholes lead back to Prop 13. I mean, that is the big elephant in the room, is that we look to developers to provide fundamental basic services and infrastructure improvements. All of this deferred maintenance, the developer's coming to town, okay, he's going to take care of the fact that the roads crap. I'm allowed to say crap, right? They are, and to some degree, there's a huge incentive for the local elected officials to do that because they don't want to increase taxes on their citizens. Prop 13 has meant that a lot of cities and towns just feel fundamentally bankrupt all the time. And so that we get this ballot that's 10,000 miles long with all of these little tax incentives, and we put as many fees, and we create a fee-based government where we try to put as much on the developer as possible to provide basic services. And it works very well as a narrative of these developers are going to pay for burdening us with all this housing. It's a very toxic cycle we get into.
Arguably, the roots of the housing crisis are in Prop 13 because it incentivizes chase of sales tax dollars over housing. And as much as I think tax exemptions for certain types of property can be interesting. It further exacerbates this imbalance between sales tax and property tax. Most property tax doesn't go to cities. We're one of the few cities that get 23%. We heard yesterday in one of the panels, some cities get 7 cents on the dollar. So it's not really going to move the needle very much. But overall, all these solutions are meant to fix for a larger problem, and until we get at the heart of that larger problem and fixing the incentives in the system, we'll never be at an equilibrium where housing prices will be affordable. And you can see major metro areas where housing is affordable without having to sprawl. We can still have our social values, but we need to build.
I mean, this gets to Brisbane that David Chu brought up earlier, the reliance on sales tax. So we are all kind of mean to Brisbane because they're looking at an opportunity to build 4,400 units of housing, and they're like, how about more hotel, retail, and office? And we're like, no, build the mixed-use project because that's what we all need. And they ran the numbers, and on an annual basis, they will make $7 million a year if they build more office, hotel, and retail, and they'll only make about $1 million a year if they build the mixed use with the housing. And citizens are expensive. They need firefighters and police and all these annoying things, and parks, and and so there's this huge incentive for Brisbane to say, there's literally 6 million reasons for me to say no, I don't want housing. And all of the other conversation around it sometimes does boil down to, well, I as an elected official have to do what's good for the citizens of Brisbane. And it's really hard when there's $6 million on the table to say, well, what's good for your citizens is to have more citizens and a mixed use where people can walk to work, and it'll reduce your traffic, and and you're trying to make this larger argument about the future of our society, and they're not interested.
But CEQA,
Oh.
jobs, housing, and
A2C.
there are reasons beyond just please do it that you have to do it. We're working on a mega project in Santa Clara in Silicon Valley where we're adding a lot of housing in an area that only had jobs. It's a CEQA issue. It's an EIR issue. You can't just get away now completely with ignoring housing, for all the problems I have with CEQA. The other thing I would say, though, is, and this is, for David knows this better than anyone, this is a big state. Statewide solutions are really, really difficult. It's like 4 states. And to get a consensus around statewide solutions is difficult. So I come back to realistically local solutions that you can do. I was pleased to hear Darrell talk, Steve, about your potential sales tax thing. Look at the last election. Alameda County passed a $570 million affordable housing bond. Santa Clara County passed a $900+ million housing bond. San Francisco has passed a $310 million housing bond, needs another. LA City passed a $1.2 billion homeless bond, and LA County passed a $350 million bond for homeless services to sort of work in tandem. Now, the execution part is a difficult part, but
Yeah, and then Orange County says they don't want to.
I think you're going to have to look for innovative financing. The initiative is largely going to be local.
But I have to say, you heard the mayor pause when he talked about securitization because he knew I was here. I'm really not a big fan of bonding out every dollar of revenue. The cost of capital becomes so great, and then we don't tend to, as public agencies, manage public capital very well.
Yeah, I'll take the $50 million. Forget the security.
We're not very efficient, and so that burdens the next generation with all these bonds. We as a city right now have a ton of bond debt from 30 years ago that is eating up about 17% of our general fund. That takes away from our ability to provide services that people need now and limits our choices. So it can't always be a bond. I think if we can fix these policy issues, and San Francisco is held up often as the challenge, there's enormous money there, so it seems like you can keep applying all of these fees and everything else and taxes, and at some point it won't break, but it will break. But those things don't work in the inland part of California.
It's interesting.
Where we don't have that kind of economic activity.
Well, can I just pause you here, because this question was about whether innovative financing is going to solve the housing shortage. Financing is a component, but we're getting back to some traditional discussions and roots that may be innovative isn't so important. Maybe it's some of what Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins was talking about this morning, is more of a coming together of alignment of what's in existence. And we've heard other speakers say learning to talk about what's already present, as opposed to thinking we have to be so bold, so far out there. Look at Senate Bill 827 and how fast that was stopped, because I think there was a reaction in the state in terms of too much, too quick. We're not ready for something so bold and so big.
It's coming back next year. I think so. I mean, and I've already had many people reach out who want to implement local versions of 827. So as many people as were sort of terrified by the scale of the solution, there are many more people who are terrified by the scale of the current problem.
I think you mentioned the Sacramento version of...
Yeah, and we've taken this into our own hands by trying to clear these barriers, and I think 827 did all of us a favor, even though it was a really ugly discussion. It had one committee hearing where it failed, and everyone acts like, it was about to be signed by the governor. But what it did is reshaped the view of what our housing conversation could be. I come out of the LGBT rights movement. It used to be we'd argue for hospital visitation, then we'd argue for some other little niche, just to have a little bit of legitimacy. I only saw the major shift in the conversation happen when we asked for marriage, because that was the big kahuna that nobody wanted to talk about. So we ate around the edges for a long time, and I think entitlement reform at the state level, where the state honestly has an obligation to make sure that local governments aren't redlining, aren't zoning out multifamily, and are doing their part, has to be in the equation. Now local officials all over the state had their hair on fire. I think that's good, because they're the problem, and they need to think about this.
Go ahead.
I just want to go back to your comment about, innovation. It doesn't always have to be this big, bold thing. Coming from an innovation company like Genentech, sometimes innovation is how we do things. So you can actually take, for example, traditional existing technology and put it together in innovative ways to have an amazing outcome. And I think that's what's really at the root here, is how do we come together in new ways rather than just having it be the developer fighting, at City Hall. How do we get the stakeholders together, listening to each other and trying to identify what that outcome is that we want, and how can we agree to work towards that outcome?
And just to follow up on the discussion of Senate Bill 827, Bill, how did you hear that bill? And what would that mean to a company like Related California to restrict from the top of the state to the bottom of the state where housing around transit could be built?
So this isn't really it's certainly not a criticism of the bill, but how it was rolled out, just my observation. It was introduced, and then boom, there's a hearing in LA. People went ballistic in West LA, and they demonized it, and they said all sorts of things that would happen that weren't true. So it set it back a little bit. I think had they maybe sort of had regional hearings, that's something the state might consider. It can't all just be in Sacramento. Go to Southern California, go to wherever, go to the Central Valley, and have hearings and get some feedback, and they'll deliver people to those hearings. They are now. Then introduce the bill, because what happened is people it's like when Jerry introduced the buy right thing. People went ballistic, and they said, oh my God, they're going to have all these projects, and you had to do 20% affordable. And I thought, you don't even understand. Developers don't do 20% affordable. That's a heavy lift. But people went crazy. And so my thought would be, do some regional hearings on this. Of course it would help. The other thing is, with the one fell swoop, 8 stories, that doesn't work everywhere. So that's, again, the regional thing. 8 stories is too much in some places, so don't just say.
I do think
we are running out of time.
You misstated the bill. It did not restrict housing.
It allowed.
It allowed.
For another path for entitlement that allowed people to bypass, in some ways, the local process in order to get approvals, because there are so many local governments that just say no.
And can I also...
Senator Wiener's word was California is about ready to do a pivot, and he's the one who has promised that he's going to continue rolling out big, bold, new legislation. I think we could keep going. I appreciate how attentive everybody is. Has anybody changed their own perspective about innovative financing. Is anybody seeing it a little bit differently because of this panel? Anyone? A couple people. All right. Have any of you changed your yes, no, no, no?
I think
Well, with that
3.5 million homes is going to freak out a lot of people, and we should be prepared for that. And it's going to be really exciting and thrilling for all of the people who are going to find housing in those.
And they can't all
Right.
be on pristine farmland, which is what many places want to do.
Right.
Thank you, everybody. Bill Whitty with Related California, Carla Barano with Genentech, Laura Foote-Clark with YIMBY, and Steve Hansen, the Vice Mayor of the City of Sacramento. I'm Beth Ruyak. My show is Insight on Capitol Public Radio, a really terrific newsroom and a terrific journalistic effort. So check us out.